Welcome to Bookish Mind, Season 05, Episode 02, where we continue our insightful journey into Daniel Goleman's profound book, Focus. After exploring the foundational basics of attention, have you ever felt your mind drift while reading, or maybe wondered if our modern world is truly shrinking our capacity to concentrate? Well, today we're going to challenge some common myths about our attention span and uncover the surprising power of collective attention. Our mission in this deep dive is really to go beyond the surface, to truly grasp how your attention works, what relentlessly pulls it away, and maybe most importantly, how we can all optimize it, both individually and as a collective.
That's right. And Goleman's focus, it builds so well on what we've discussed before about attention. It gives such a nuanced and practical look at something that, well, whether you notice it consciously or not, it shapes pretty much every moment of your day. It's incredibly relevant stuff.
Definitely. So let's start by zeroing in on what Goleman calls selective attention. We all know that feeling, right? Trying to focus on one thing when, like, a million other things are clamoring for your mind's real estate. William James, the psychologist, he had that great description of attention as the sudden taking possession by the mind of one of what seems several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thought.
Yeah, that's the classic definition.
But the real magic here, I think, the crucial insight Goleman highlights, isn't just about focusing. It's your brain's kind of masterful skill at actively deleting everything else to give you that clarity.
Exactly. It's not just adding focus, it's subtracting noise.
And Goleman gives some great personal examples. He talks about being a teenager, doing his homework, while listening to Béla Bartók's string quartets, which he admits were slightly cacophonous.
Not exactly background music.
Right. Yet he found that tuning out those kind of discordant tones somehow helped him focus on, a chemical equation or whatever. Or later, working at the New York Times science desk, completely immersed in what he called cacophony, reporters chatting, phones ringing, editors shouting, just chaos.
Sounds stressful.
Totally.
Yeah.
But he says they'd redouble their focus, tuning out the roar, just to meet their deadlines. It just shows that incredible human ability to, block out the world when needed.
And what's really fascinating is how Goleman breaks down the distractions that challenge this selective focus. You've got two main types.
Okay.
On one hand, there are the sensory distractors. Now, these are generally the easier ones for your brain to handle, to sort of tune out.
Like what?
Well, think about it. As you're listening to us right now, you're probably ignoring the feeling of your clothes, maybe the chair you're sitting on, or the low hum of your computer.
Right, yeah. I wasn't thinking about that at all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Our brain is incredibly efficient at weeding out this continuous wash of background sounds, shapes and colors, tastes, smells, sensations. It's like an automatic, constant filtering system just running in the background.
Okay, that makes sense. So what's the other type?
Well, then you have the much more formidable challenge, emotional distractors.
Ooh, okay.
Imagine trying to concentrate on something important, and then you overhear someone nearby mention your name.
Oh, yeah, instant attention grabber.
Totally. Or maybe just a snippet of conversation about something you really care about. Your attention just snaps to it immediately. It's almost impossible not to tune in because, well, our brains are basically hardwired to prioritize emotionally significant information.
That makes sense.
And often the biggest, most persistent emotional challenge comes from inside us, right? Personal emotional turmoil, a recent argument, a big worry, that stuff can powerfully intrude on your focus.
Yeah, it replays in your head.
Exactly. And the key, Goleman points out, is learning to tell the difference between fruitless rumination, just endlessly replaying worries without getting anywhere, and productive reflection.
What's the difference there?
Productive reflection is where you engage with the problem, but just long enough to maybe come up with a tentative solution or insight, and then can let those distressing thoughts go. Making that distinction is so critical for freeing up your focus again.
And this isn't just like a theoretical thing, is it? It has real-world impact.
Yep.
The sources mention a test on college athletes, looking at how susceptible they were to anxiety messing with their concentration. And what's really striking is how strongly that susceptibility correlated with their actual performance during the season. It's not just about physical skill, but managing that internal emotional noise under pressure.
Absolutely. And that really highlights the crucial role of our prefrontal brain regions. Think of them as the brain's executive conductor.
Okay.
They boost the signals we want to focus on, like, say, an important email, while actively dampening down the ones we want to ignore, like the chatter nearby.
So it's like turning up the volume on one thing and turning it down on others?
Precisely. And here's a kind of surprising part. Our selective attention wiring actually includes the circuitry for inhibiting emotion.
Really?
Yeah. So this means that people with really well-developed focus are often relatively immune to emotional turbulence. It can make them more unflappable in a crisis. You can keep a clearer head when things get intense. And this ability, this capacity to consciously disengage your attention from one thing and fluidly move it to another, it's actually essential for your mental well-being. It sounds simple, but it's huge.
How so?
Well, if we can't do this, our minds can get stuck in these repeating loops of chronic anxiety. And at the clinical extremes, this inability can show up as, deep hopelessness and depression, or unmanageable panic and anxiety disorders, or those endless cycles in OCD. The power to deliberately shift your focus, it really dictates so much of your mental freedom.
But let's flip that, because there's an incredible upside too, right? Strong selective attention is what lets us get totally swept away by a moving scene in a film.
Completely lost in it.
Or, lose themselves in YouTube or their homework to the point of being oblivious to whatever tumult might be nearby.
Yeah, kids are great at that sometimes.
Totally. Think about someone at a really loud, busy party. They can completely immerse themselves in a conversation, their eyes locked on the other person, even with music blaring right next to them. That deep immersion, that's the positive side of strong selective attention. Okay, so even with this powerful selective attention, the reality is our minds love to wander. If you've ever found yourself reading a page and suddenly realizing you have absolutely no idea what you just read, well, you're definitely not alone.
Happens to everyone.
And here's where it gets really interesting statistically. Research shows a reader's mind typically wanders anywhere from 20 to 40% of the time while reading something.
That much. Wow.
Yeah. And the consequence? Predictably, worse comprehension. But even more surprising, they did this test where the text suddenly turned into gibberish, like, we must make some circus for the money instead of we must make some money for the circus.
Okay.
About 30% of readers kept going for an average of 17 words before they even noticed the nonsense.
17 words of gibberish. That's quite a disconnect.
Isn't it? A huge mental disconnect.
It really is. And it points to what we call deep comprehension. See, when you're really reading properly, your mind isn't just processing words on a page. It's actively building a mental model.
Like a framework.
Exactly. Connecting the new information to what you already understand, forming this kind of expanding web of understanding. That's how real learning sticks. But when your mind zones out, it creates holes in that web. Your comprehension becomes incomplete, fragmented.
Okay, I see.
And this brings us to a pretty stark contrast with the digital world, doesn't it? The internet, with its constant bombardment of texts, videos, images, and miscellaneous messages, it can really be the enemy of the more full understanding that comes from what Nicholas Carr calls deep reading.
Right, that sustained focus.
Exactly. Deep reading needs sustained concentration and immersion in a topic. It's not about hopscotching from one thing to another, nabbing disconnected factoids. That directly challenges the brain's natural way of building that solid mental model.
It makes me think of Martin Heidegger's warning way back in the 1950s. He was worried about a tide of technological revolution that could make calculative thinking, that quick, analytical, sort of surface-level thought, the only way we think.
At the expense of something deeper.
Right, at the loss of what he called meditative thinking, which he saw as essential to being fully human. You can just imagine him being horrified if asked to tweet today, can't you?
Oh, absolutely.
It really highlights how that constant distraction leads to what Goleman calls shallow reflection. If we're always being interrupted, our thoughts just become less profound, maybe more trivial.
Yeah, less depth.
So, have you ever felt like your attention span is just getting shorter? You're definitely not alone if you have. There's this popular myth kind of circulating out there about it.
The shrinking attention span idea.
Exactly. There's this anecdote about Clay Shirky, the social media expert. He was seen typing furiously on his laptop in a crowded Swiss convention hall, just completely oblivious to the chaos around him. Didn't notice a thing until someone actually spoke his name.
Total focus.
Right, and it really highlights that attention is a limited capacity. His intense concentration basically filled that capacity until something forced it to shift.
Okay.
Now, the myth goes something like this. George Miller's research from the 50s identified our attention limit as 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information. Remember that?
The magic number 7, yeah.
But more recently, some cognitive scientists suggested it had actually shrunk to a new limit of just 4 chunks. And that idea really grabbed the public's attention. You saw headlines like, "Mind's limit found, 4 bits of information."
Right, and everyone panicked.
Yeah, many people took this as proof, an indictment of our distracted, 21st century lives, like technology ruined our brains.
But here's the crucial debunking of that myth, and it's important. Justin Halberta, a cognitive scientist at Johns Hopkins, he clarifies this really well. He says, quote, "Working memory hasn't shrunk. It's not the case that TV has made our working memory smaller."
So it's not actually smaller.
No. Our minds are actually incredibly clever at making the most of the resources they have. We use these things called memory strategies, like chunking numbers together. Remembering 415 as one chunk and an area code instead of 3 separate numbers.
Ah, okay.
That allows us to effectively expand beyond that apparent fixed limit of 4. So Halberta says, both 4 and 7 are right, depending on how you measure it. It's really about how we organize the information, not some fundamental shrinking of our brain's capacity.
That's a relief. Okay, so our capacity hasn't shrunk. But what about multitasking? Everyone thinks they can do it.
Ah, yes, the great multitasking debate. Many people really believe they're splitting their attention, like stretching a balloon wider and wider.
Covering more ground.
But cognitive science is pretty clear. That's basically a fiction. Instead of splitting attention, what we're actually doing is switching rapidly between tasks. Back and forth, back and forth.
Okay, so it feels like doing 2 things, but it's really just fast switching.
Exactly. And this continual switching saps attention from full concentrated engagement. It doesn't expand our capacity at all. It systematically drains it. The cognitive cost of that rapid switching is far higher than most people realize. It leads to more errors, less retention.
It's fascinating that even tech companies are starting to recognize this drain on our attention. Carnegie Mellon University research actually highlights that human attention is, get this, the most precious resource in a computer system.
That's quite a statement.
Isn't it?
Mm.
Their Project Aura, for example, is trying to minimize technological distractions, trying to get rid of all those annoying system glitches and pop-ups so we don't waste our precious focus time.
And while those tech fixes are definitely laudable, and they certainly can help, the real issue, as Goleman points out, isn't just technological. It's fundamentally a cognitive one. Meaning, the frontal assault on our focusing ability isn't solely from the devices themselves, the hardware. It's from the sheer mounting tide of distractions that they deliver. The problem isn't just the pipeline, it's the overwhelming volume of stuff constantly flowing through it.
Right. The constant notifications, the endless scroll.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the individual brain, its limits, the distractions. But what if I told you there's a surprising way we can actually expand our attention, far beyond what any single person can manage alone?
Intriguing.
This brings us to the really exciting concept of collective attention, building on Clay Shirky's work, particularly with social media. Goleman suggests that while individually, our focus is limited, all of us together create a collective bandwidth for attention that we each can access as needed.
That's a powerful idea.
And Wikipedia is maybe the prime example of this phenomena in action, isn't it?
It absolutely is. Shirky, in his book, Here Comes Everybody, he really unpacks this. He argues that attention, much like memory or other kinds of cognitive expertise, can actually be distributed among many people.
So it's not just in one head.
Right. Think about what's trending now on social media. It's not just some random fleeting topic. It's a direct indicator of how we, as a collective, are choosing to allocate this shared resource, this shared attention.
Never thought of it that way.
And this raises a really fascinating debate, doesn't it? Does all this tech-facilitated learning and shared memory actually dumb us down because we start relying on external systems, outsourcing our memory? Or does it create a kind of mental prosthesis that expands the power of individual attention, allowing us to achieve much more together than we could alone?
That is a compelling question. And this idea, it also extends to something Goleman calls weak ties.
Ah, yes. Not just your close friends.
Exactly. Most of us have a handful of strong ties, our closest friends, family. But we might have hundreds, maybe thousands of weak ties. Think about your Facebook friends, former colleagues you barely talk to, casual acquaintances.
People on the periphery.
Right. But these aren't just meaningless numbers on a screen. Goleman emphasizes how they serve as extra sets of eyes and ears on the world. They act as multipliers of our attention capacity for finding out about all sorts of things. Good shopping deals, job possibilities, even potential dating partners.
Things your inner circle might never know about.
Precisely. They provide crucial information, diverse perspectives we might never encounter otherwise.
So when we coordinate what we see and what we know through this kind of collective effort, it genuinely multiplies our cognitive wealth. Even though our individual working memory might be small at any given moment, the total amount of data we can collectively pull through and process becomes potentially huge.
Wow.
This collective intelligence, the sum total of what multiple eyes can notice and share, it promises maximal focus, but on a grand societal scale.
And this isn't just a cool theory, right? Researchers at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, they've done a lot of work on collective intelligence. They highlight how the internet, especially through things like search engines, allows us to efficiently harvest all that cognitive work.
Like tapping into a global brain.
Kind of. It's like we're all contributing in small ways to this giant, constantly growing mental database that everyone can access.
And the MIT group's fundamental question really sums it all up beautifully. They ask, how can we connect people and computers so that collectively we act with more intelligence than any one person or group?
That's the key question.
It really is, and it resonates so strongly with that elegant Japanese proverb. All of us are smarter than any one of us.
That's powerful. Okay, so we've journeyed through individual attention, the minefield of digital distractions, and now this mind-expanding idea of collective intelligence. But what happens when that individual focus aligns perfectly with your deeper sense of purpose, maybe even joy?
Now you're talking about flow.
Exactly, the power of flow. And maybe to start thinking about this, let me just ask you, the listener, when you get up in the morning, are you genuinely happy about getting to work or school or whatever it is that occupies most of your day?
That's a really probing question, and it touches directly on the concept of good work, a term explored by people like Howard Gardner at Harvard, William Damon at Stanford, and Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, the psychologist who actually coined the term flow.
Right, the father of flow.
Exactly. They define good work as this potent mix of what people are excellent at, what engages them, and their ethics, what they truly believe matters. It's about finding those high absorption callings where people genuinely love what they're doing.
And that love, that engagement leads to flow.
Often, yes. When you love what you're doing, you're much more likely to experience flow, that state of complete absorption where, as Csikszentmihalyi says, pleasure is the emotional marker. You just feel good doing it.
That sounds amazing.
It is. But interestingly, flow is actually quite rare in daily life for most people. Research indicates only about 20% of people experience moments of flow at least once a day.
Only 20%.
Yeah. And maybe even more striking, about 15% say they never enter a flow state during a typical day.
Wow. So what are the rest doing?
Well, for most people, Csikszentmihalyi found their day is largely spent either feeling stressed or feeling bored, which is a pretty stark contrast to that deep, joyful engagement of flow.
That's kind of sad, actually. So if it's so rare, how do we find more of it? How do we get into flow? Goleman talks about several doorways to flow. One obvious one is simply aligning what we do with what we genuinely enjoy. Those fortunate people whose jobs bring them immense pleasure.
The lucky few.
Right. Another pathway opens up when we tackle tasks that are just manageable, meaning demands that challenge our abilities right to their edge, pushing us, but without completely overwhelming us.
Yeah.
That sweet spot.
Not too easy, not too hard.
Exactly. And of course, pursuing something we're truly passionate about. That intrinsic motivation is a huge driver that naturally pulls us into a flow state.
Absolutely. But in essence, Goleman argues no matter which doorway you happen to enter through, the final common pathway to achieving flow is always full focus.
It comes back to focus.
Always. A keen focus jumpstarts flow. When you're in that optimal brain state during flow, it's characterized by what neuroscientists call greater neural harmony.
Neural harmony. Sounds nice.
It means there's this rich, perfectly timed interconnection happening among diverse brain areas. The circuits relevant to the task are highly active, humming along efficiently, while the irrelevant ones are quiet, quiescent. Your brain is performing at its absolute peak, allowing you to perform at your personal best, whatever you're doing.
That sounds like the ideal state for productivity and enjoyment. But sadly, as you said, it's not the reality for many in their daily work lives. Workplace surveys often find huge numbers of people who are just disengaged. Yeah, they're daydreaming, maybe wasting hours online, just doing the bare minimum to get by. Their attention scatters.
Right.
And then there's that other large group who are stuck in what neurobiologists call frazzle.
Frazzle. Not a good state.
No, it's a state of constant stress, emotional exhaustion, heading towards burnout. And in that state, their attention fixates on their worries, not their job.
Mm.
It's the polar opposite of that focused, energized flow state.
Absolutely. So full focus really does offer us this potential doorway into flow, into optimal experience. But it's also important to remember that even when we achieve that high focus, when we choose to concentrate on one thing and consciously ignore the rest, we're constantly navigating this subtle, usually invisible, constant tension between different regions in our brain.
A balancing act.
Exactly. Our brain is constantly making these tiny choices, negotiations really, about what to bring into the spotlight of awareness and what to push into the background.
So wow, we've covered a lot today.
Yeah.
We went from the incredible, almost, magical power of selective attention
The brain's filter.
to the undeniable reality of distraction in our digital age. How we kind of busted that myth about a shrinking attention span.
Yeah, that was important.
And finally exploring the immense and maybe surprising potential of collective attention and those deeply satisfying, elusive flow states.
Quite a journey through the landscape of focus.
It really is. And it seems clear that while our individual attention definitely has its inherent limits, we also possess this incredible capacity to choose our focus, to actively manage those ever-present distractions, and maybe even to leverage the vastness of collective intelligence for some pretty remarkable outcomes.
Absolutely. Which leads to a final thought, perhaps, given that our brains are constantly making these choices about what to focus on and what to ignore, and we know our digital world offers both unprecedented distractions and unprecedented ways to connect our intelligence.
Right.
How might intentionally cultivating our weak ties, those broader connections, and consciously seeking out those just manageable challenges more regularly, how might that not just enhance your individual focus, but maybe even contribute in some small way to a smarter, more focused collective? It's a powerful thought to consider, I think, for your own life and maybe even beyond.
And that really is something to chew on. So what does all this mean for how you approach your daily tasks and learning? We definitely encourage you to reflect on your own experiences with focus and distraction as you go about your day. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into Daniel Goleman's Focus.